With us today will be a diverse panel who will explore how we can support Indigenous and community land rights and their agency to accelerate global transformation towards a more just, resilient, and sustainable future, and what different actors can do to make that happen. This event is part of the Leadership Dialogue, the first Leadership Dialogue, which aims to explore how to transform our relationship with nature and simultaneously advance justice, inclusion through intergenerational equity. So with that, I would like to invite our panelists. I see Arcana there, and I don't know if others are available. Okay, they're getting ready. So perhaps I'll ask Joan to help set the scene for us. So Joan is Global Director of the Indigenous Peoples Rights International. And Joan, please come. While Joan is getting ready, the question that we'd like to ask her is, as a long-time advocate of the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples and the struggle to end criminalization of land rights defenders, what are the key roles of Indigenous peoples, local communities, and land rights defenders in safeguarding forest and biodiversity? What challenges do they face? And why is it important that we apply a rights-based approach in all of these things? Thank you.
Thank you. And that's quite a handful of questions to respond. So I'll just put some overview in response to the three questions, but probably also to set the context of our discussion today. And I will focus more on Indigenous peoples because that's where I'm coming from. So just to say that Indigenous peoples around the world is more than 460 million, living in 93 countries, and 6% of the total global population. And these Indigenous peoples are living and nurturing different ecosystems, from forests to rivers to mountains to savanna to deserts and other ecosystems. Now, historically, Indigenous peoples have nurtured these ecosystems as a matter of collective survival. And that collective survival is not only the survival of the present generation, but the future generations. So practices and values revolved around this relationship with nature in an interdependent, harmonious relationship so that humanity can survive. Survive now and the future. And that is why we, as Indigenous peoples, say that a stewardship of nature is our lifestyle. It is in our DNA. It is in our cultures. It is in our identities. It is our dignity as peoples. So when we're talking of conservation, when we're talking of stewardship, that is nothing new for Indigenous peoples. When we're talking of protection of the environment, or say the destruction of environment, what do Indigenous peoples do? We defend. That is the right thing to do for us. One of our elders, I come from the Cordillera region in the Philippines, and one of our elders say, when they were threatened by a large dams, said, when our land is threatened, what do? We fight and defend, because land is life. It is our duty to defend. It is our obligation to protect the land, not only for us, but for the future generation. That I think summarizes our role in stewarding nature. Now, what are the threats? What are the challenges that we face? Let us not forget that states were created by taking over our lands and resources. It was through colonization, forced assimilation, that started that historical marginalization and conflict with indigenous peoples. Our lands were suddenly in the name of state, of the kings of the colonial powers. It was never identified as integral to our survival. So it alienated us from our lands and resources. And it's not that it only alienated us with the imposition of legal, political, and economic system, but it also changed the value of land and resources. It suddenly became commercial elements that profit can be derived from. It's not the way we value these resources. And that is the reason why there's so many conflicts, because in indigenous territories, right? Because business wants to take over, and legally they are allowed by the state to take over, and we are evicted. We are evicted by business on one side and conservation on the other side, because they also see us as enemies. When we use our resources for our livelihoods, that's not considered conservation. That's considered destruction. And so in this whole context, we're criminalized. Because legally, we are not the owners of these resources. Legally, we are not recognized as the stewards. So that sets the problem of the key challenges that we are facing now, which is compounded by the impacts of climate change. We have the least carbon footprint, we suffer the most, but also we are challenged by the solutions of climate change when with renewable energy, there's renewed mining for lithium that will be used for, and we are again victimized the second time around. So finally, so these are the challenges, and finally the human rights-based approach to on how we protect our resources, right? I think there's a lot of talk about human rights-based approach. Everybody's talking now about human rights-based approach to conservation, human rights-based approach to climate change solutions, but it's being said in the abstract. When we say human rights-based approach for indigenous peoples, we mean the protection of our land, territories, and resources, an end to land grabbing. We mean that we need to be on the table for decision making. That is our right. We mean we will be able to practice our traditional occupations and livelihoods without fear. We mean women are protected against violence when they go to the forest to harvest their food. We mean that when our rights are violated, those that violate our rights are prosecuted. That there is access to justice. When we protect our rights and we are being jailed. That's what we mean when we talk about a human rights-based approach. So I think when we move to a human rights-based approach, it means we need to address the realities on the ground, on what's happening in relation to the exercise of the rights of indigenous people, so that we can continue to be the stewards of nature. We can continue to live with dignity. We can continue to live like others without discrimination. That is what we mean when we say human rights-based approach. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joan, for that very powerful message, and I do hope you'll be able to be with us until the end, as I'm sure lots of people would have questions for Joan. Next, I would like to invite my boss, Madame Solange Bandiaki-Badji, coordinator of the Rights and Resources Initiative, to take the mic. Solange, Why tenure rights? Why should we focus on this? And why communities in particular, and women more specifically? Because we do know you have such a strong, prominent interest in women's rights, and so we'd like to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Alain, and good afternoon, everyone. It's hard to speak after Joanne, who is really, well immersed into the issues. But as part of setting the scene and adding to the context, and I have 4 minutes, I'll try to raise 4 points. One is the fact that community tenure is linked to a variety of topical issues. But here I would just like to raise 2 important issues. One is that the legal recognition and secure land and resource rights for indigenous peoples, local communities, Afro-descendant peoples, and women within those communities are really fundamental to the advancement of global climate conservation and sustainable development goals. So all the targets, all the goals that we have, all of this is contributing to it. And the second point is that tenure security is important for the pursuit of social, economic, and environmental imperatives. And Joanne actually mentioned how securing land rights is really key to the livelihoods of indigenous peoples and local communities on the ground. I would like also to raise 2 main challenges. There are so many challenges, but for the sake of time, I will just raise 2. One is the challenge related to implementation. And there's a gap there, because even though communities customarily hold and use over 50% of the world land, they legally own only 10%. And the good news is that we have the Tenure Facility, actually, who is here and working on the implementation of rights recognition. But there is a lot that needs to be done in terms of, okay, how do we fill that gap? How do we make sure that those who customarily own and use the resources, they can legally own it? So our aim, for example, at the Rights and Resources Initiative is that by 2030, 50% of the tropical forested land are legally owned by indigenous peoples, local communities, and Afro-descendant people, including women within those communities. Another challenge is related to vulnerability. The absence of tenure security renders communities and their land and forests vulnerable to encroachment of external pressure. And like Joanne was saying, you have the private sector coming into communities, taking their land, and that is really having a toll on their livelihood and also on their capacity to sustainably manage those lands. On the importance, and finally, I would like to talk about the importance of securing women's land and resource rights. It is important to know that as we're talking about securing the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities, it goes hand in hand with securing the rights of women. Without that, we cannot talk about sustainability. And what we're realizing also, many of the national laws and policies are still behind in terms of protecting and recognizing legally the rights of women to land and to resources. Another aspect is related to climate finance, as the previous panel was mentioning. And what we're realizing, or what we're seeing, is that indigenous women, local women, peasant women, and women, Afro-descendant women, are not really benefiting from climate finance. And there's a call to action that the Rights and Resources is putting in place, and has been there for months now, is that how do we make sure that climate finance is gender inclusive? How do we make sure that the money that we're talking about will have to reach indigenous peoples and local community, but specifically indigenous women on the ground, who are really playing a key role in conservation, livelihood, transmitting knowledge to other generation. So I just wanted to raise that as part of the framing, and these are the key issues I'm sure the panelists will have to go in depth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Solange, for those insightful points that we all need to remind ourselves of. I would like to invite our panelists to come to the stage with us for our discussion. So I see Nemonte, Arcana, Rushka, please.
Yes.
Oh, and yes, Saradi Veira. Oh, yes, please, please, please. Okay. All right.
I'm just translating for her.
Okay. Okay, we're good. Okay, so thank you. So maybe first I'd like to introduce our panelists. Nemonte Nenquino is co-founder of the Sabo Alliance and Amazon Frontlines. She is indigenous leader from the Guarani people of the Ecuadorian Amazon. We have Anoshka Violeta Ire Cameno. She is member of the Harabut people from the people, a native community of Masanahue in Peru, and member of the board of FENAMAD. We have Sarah Elvira Kumanun, who is president of Saminyora, the Sami National Youth Organization of the Swedish part of Sapmi. And we have Arcana Sorang, who is from the Kadia tribe in India, and she is member of the UN General Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change and a climate activist in India. To all of our panelists, I'd like to ask the following questions. We'd like to know a little bit more about who you are, the role and importance of the people you represent in safeguarding nature, and what are the main challenges that you face in doing so. So perhaps we will start with Arcana, please.
Johar everyone. My name is Archana Soreng and I belong to Khadia tribe. My grandfather was a pioneer in community-led forest protection practices. Both of my parents were engaged in asserting rights of indigenous people and local communities. While growing up, given the circumstances of my communities and the region I come from, both of my parents emphasized that if you want to contribute back to the society, you have to enter into policy making. And I think that is what stayed with me and motivated me to pursue political science and enter into the policy making spaces and pursue masters in regulatory governance. My father was also an indigenous healthcare practitioner. So I have seen him practicing indigenous healthcare medicine, specifically in terms of snake bites. And while growing up, I always used to wonder that he doesn't have an education qualification on these medicines. But I still see people getting cured. So how does it work? And that's when I also understood the terminology of traditional knowledge and practices. I also understood, like for us indigenous people, how traditional knowledge and practices goes from generation to generation through oral way. And that is which also made me realize that a lot of our history, culture, and tradition is in the oral history in the form of dance, folklore, songs, and story. And while growing up, I had this feeling that I come from an indigenous community, but as a young person from indigenous community, I have always been looked down by people around me, which now in today's context, it makes me feel very different because all of a sudden the world has started recognizing the role of indigenous people and the contribution towards climate action and biodiversity conservation, which I again feel that it's very sad because over the years, indigenous people, young people have been looked down upon because of their identity, culture, and tradition. And this has also led to loss of culture, tradition, and language, and also has led to self-doubt amongst the indigenous youth. And when we talk about preservation of traditional knowledge and practices, and when we talk about meaningful leadership and participation of young people and indigenous communities, I think it's really, really important to go back, undo the injustice, acknowledge the injustices done to the indigenous people, local communities, and it is only then we'll be able to have a meaningful leadership and participation of indigenous young people and indigenous people all together. While I was in masters, what struck me is a lot of literature which I was reading in the textbook is always I had seen in my family, whether it is in terms of community-led forest protection practices or whether it is in terms of eco-friendly way of living, which also made me realize all of these literatures are not written by indigenous people. All of these literatures are written by non-indigenous people, and that's when I felt that given the opportunity of accessing education, I want to be in these spaces. I want to write the traditional knowledge and practices, my identity, culture, tradition through my way and to amplify it, because I feel we indigenous people can speak about ourselves better than anyone else. When also I lost my father in masters, which also made me realize that our indigenous elders will not be with us forever. It's very important for us to go back to them, learn from them as an indigenous young person, because we as a young person are the bridge at the moment. We have to go back to them, learn from them, preserve it for our upcoming generation. And that's when I started actively engaging in the climate action discourse as well as rights recognition, because I felt it's really important for us indigenous people to be part of this decision-making spaces. Policies needs to be made through us and with us, which also made me realize that we cannot be part of the decision-making process if our rights are not recognized, because if our rights are not recognized, we are not safe. And it comes down to the safety and security of the indigenous people, right to livelihood and right to dignified life in order to have our rights recognized. And it's only then we'll be able to participate in the decision-making process and contribute to the process which we can. And summing up on what are the challenges we are facing at the moment, I think one of the major challenges we are facing is extractive developmental projects in our area, which is leading to land grabbing, eviction, loss of our traditional knowledge and practices, which in the lens of climate action, if we see, people tend to see that indigenous people are really important stakeholders for climate action. But if you do not address the threats to indigenous people, we cannot work together for climate action. And I think that's really, really crucial. The second thing which I feel as a threat or the challenges which we are facing is in terms of accessibility and in terms of contextualization of issues. If I go to my village, there are a lot of indigenous elders who know what is climate action, who know solutions to the climate crisis, and who have been working towards it. But the entire terminology of climate action is an English term. So I think it's really important for as policymakers and as different stakeholders coming together to make sure that we are contextualizing these issues in the ground and ensuring that there's a bottom-up approach in this entire processes. At the same time, I also feel there is so much imposition of developmental worldview on us indigenous people, and even though we say like there's a lot of conversation around capacity building of indigenous people and local communities. I think, yes, capacity building is important, but it depends on the contextualization of how we are ensuring that indigenous people need to be part of the processes. Like, for example, the international policy making process itself is complex, but it needs to come from a place of respect and solidarity, and that's where it will make difference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Oksana. Thank you for those insightful words. Sara, Elvira, we'd like to hear from where you come from the Sami people up north, and the challenges that you face, and a little bit more about your situation.
Yes, do you hear? Yep, I hear myself. Yeah, my name is Sara Elvira Kokmonen. I am 22 years old, from Jokkmokk, in the northern part of Sweden. I am from a reindeer herding family, and I am the president of SIANI. I have been in the board for 4 years now, and the president for 1 year, so this is my second year of that. SIANI, we are the Sami Youth Association in the Swedish part of Sápmi, and our aim is to promote and protect the interests and rights of our Sami youth. And what we do, we are creating meeting venues, running political issues, and standing up for our future. So that's very briefly what we do. The question you had about the role, I would say that our role is to protect the nature, of course, and our land and waters, because now we can see that the society are saving the nature by destroying the nature. And with that I mean that they are building new mines, they are doing all with the windmills, and that's not so sustainable. We have been here for thousands of years, but you cannot see that we have been here. And why that? It's because we have a respect for the nature, for our home. We have learned to treat it with respect because it's something that is living. I have learned that the earth is only for loan to us, so it's not something that we own. It's something that we have to loan, that we have to manage to our future generations, so they will have something left for the future. And I feel that for me it's very important because I want my future children and generations to have this, what I got from my ancestors, that is the culture, the language, and the reindeer herding. And the biggest challenge that I see in Sweden right now is the green transition. This is an excuse to step over our indigenous rights. The indigenous rights for us is human rights. It's our lives. We don't have any other lives. And Sweden is very good at criticizing other countries for how they treat human rights and their indigenous people, but they cannot look how it is in their own country. I would say that I think many of you have heard about Gallok, the mining plants up in Jokkmokk. This is something that I have been very engaged in this last year because it's something that affects the members of my organization and also my family. I belong to one of these two Sami communities that are getting affected if it will be a mine there. And this is a great example of how the government claim that you have to have this mine to make it possible to have this green transition. But it's not that green when everyone isn't included. Then it's not that sustainable. And yesterday I attended at the inauguration of a new authority in Sweden, the Institute of Human Rights, and I'm really hopeful and I really want to see what happens when we have an institute in Sweden that will see how it actually is in Sweden, because not so many know that the human rights aren't respected fully out. So, yeah, I stop there.
Thank you, Selva Rivera. So challenges are not just in the global south, they're also north, and we have to acknowledge that and also deal with it as well. For our next two speakers, we will have direct translation or some. We have to arrange that. Ah, sorry.
And we will have to cut down the question because otherwise we won't have time.
So we're just arranging the stage so we can have our translators come up. Do you have one of these things, or you'll take the mic? Right, so perhaps we'll ask Anushka to tell us a little bit more about where she comes from, the role and importance of her people in safeguarding nature and the challenges that they face. Please.
Da kichi wairiomei, da kichi ayatada. Iñoi eindo, arakbut wetone, ayamo maening, wandakda. Estoy saludando en mi lengua arakbut, soy de la comunidad Masenagua. Soy defensora y responsable del área territorio de la Federación Nativa de Río Madre de Dios y afluentes FENAMAT. Como mujer nos preocupa, varones y mujeres, ante las amenazas, ante la deforestación, el crimen que está pasando en nuestra región. El gobierno peruano no nos considera, no está protegiendo como debe ser, pero para buscar financiamiento, a través de ello, poco o nada hacen para los pueblos indígenas de Madre de Dios. Yo quisiera compartir una experiencia que como mujer, mi familia, se hizo una interdicción a los mineros, porque la FENAMAT, hablar de territorio es grande. FENAMAT defiende los derechos humanos, derechos colectivos de los pueblos, de las 37 comunidades, 7 pueblos, y trabaja, depende de la estructura orgánica dentro de la institución. Nosotros como indígenas, como protectoras, mis padres han sido civilizados en el año 50. Mi padre y mi madre viven hasta hoy, por lo cual tengo esa responsabilidad, ese rol de mujer para defender mi territorio, mis comunidades.
So the speaker first spoke on her mother tongue. And greetings from the Harabut people. And I am a defender, an indigenous defender from the Harabut people and from the Masenawa community. I'm also a member of FENAMAD, and we are a community that live by the Madre de Deus river basin. I would like to talk today about the threats that we are having in our community and also the crimes that are happening in our region. The Peruvian government does not protect our people, despite all the funding that they get to do so. They are not protecting our people. I would like to talk about the experiences that we have in which mining was prohibited in parts of the region, but we are also FENAMAD, and FENAMAD is a huge structure. It represents 37 communities and 7 peoples. And as indigenous peoples, we need to protect our lands. My parents, for example, they were civilized in the 50s, and thanks to them, I learned the role that I have to defend my territories.
Me siento muy orgullosa de mis ancestros, por lo cual las mujeres y varones sufrimos la misma amenaza. Nuestro territorio está en riesgos. Nos quieren desaparecer a los pueblos indígenas. Y eso nosotras no vamos a permitir. Estamos empoderadas. La lucha sigue de pie y por eso traigo esta preocupación para que ustedes escuchen la voz indígena desde las propias comunidades. Nuestra organización es criminalizada, seguido por persecución. No nos quieren escuchar las demandas que hace FENAMAT. Los jueces fiscales están a favor a las empresas porque son empresas petroleras, empresas madereras, mineras que están destruyendo con máquinas grandes, pesadas. Y que esto a nosotros como pueblos originarios que somos dueños, nos sentimos en abandono, estamos en abandono, y que los pueblos indígenas levantamos la voz que como que el gobierno no trabaja a favor de los pueblos indígenas. La FENAMAT también eso trabajamos como organización defendiendo a los pueblos no contactados, a los hermanos indígenas que están en el bosque.
That's okay. That's okay. I am also very proud of my ancestors, and in our communities, we suffer many threats, and our territories are at risk, and they want to extinguish indigenous peoples. And, but we will not allow that to happen. The struggle goes on. I'm here to talk to you about our challenges, and you hear at first hand what we are suffering in our territories. The government does not hear our demands, and FENAMAD works to protect those indigenous peoples. The judges, prosecutors, they also do not listen to what we are saying. We have heavy machinery in our territories from these mining activities. We, as indigenous peoples, will raise our voices to be heard. The government does not work for indigenous peoples. And as FENAMAD, we are also working to protect and assist those indigenous peoples that are in the forest, those that live in involuntary isolation.
¿Sigo?
Can she go
Sí.
on?
Okay. Gracias. Nosotras como mujeres queremos el desarrollo. Muchas veces los indígenas nos tildan como opositores del desarrollo, pero sin embargo nosotros queremos el desarrollo a nuestro criterio, a nuestra manera, a nuestra forma.
Thank you. As indigenous women, we want development. But sometimes people think that we indigenous peoples, we do not want development. And we do want the development, but the development the way we see it, the way we understand it.
Queremos seguridad territorial propio de nosotros, no un terreno prestado, sino que sea algo porque la naturaleza es de nosotros. Por respeto a la madre, nuestra madre tierra, que está destruido y está dolido mucho. Sabemos que los pueblos indígenas existen. Tenemos el convenio a nivel internacional de la OIT, que es 169, pero en sí no lo practican en la práctica. Y eso a nosotros nos tiene sin cuidado, sin defensa. Pero nosotros desde nuestras comunidades vamos a seguir luchando, vamos a seguir frente a todas estas amenazas. Daré mi vida, daré todo lo que yo pueda, las fuerzas, y las mujeres seguimos estar preparadas políticamente, ser preparadas para defender nuestros derechos y también sabiendo que se puede trabajar con la soberanía para el desarrollo, que nosotros, los pueblos indígenas, somos muy vulnerables. Tenemos riqueza, tenemos nuestro propio banco, tenemos salud, pero eso no nos hacen respetar.
We want land security. We not want something that they just lend to us. We want our territory because nature is ours. We need to respect Mother Earth because Mother Earth is it's hurting now. We have rights that are recognized internationally, such as enshrined in the ILO Convention 169, but the problem is that it's not implemented, and that's one of the challenges we have. But the struggle goes on. We will not give up to the threats that we are facing, and I will continue battling, even if I need to give my life for it. We need to work to achieve sovereignty, and then we can talk about development. We have wealth as indigenous peoples. We have our own banks, and we have health, and they need to recognize our rights.
Dios lo bendiga. Muchas gracias, Dakichi. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anushka. Thank you for that very insightful presentation. I would like to ask Nemonte to share her thoughts around where you come from, Nemonte, the people you represent and their role in safeguarding nature, as well as some of the challenges that you face in your home.
Bueno, mi nombre es Nemonte Nenquimo. Soy una mujer guaraní de la Amazonía del Ecuador. Y mi nombre significa muchas estrellas y mi apellido es Cara de Sol.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Nemonte Nenquimo. I come from the Ecuadorian Amazon. I'm a Waorani woman, and my name means many stars, face of the sun.
Bueno, me gusta contar la historia de mi pueblo, primeramente para un poco hablar. Nosotros como pueblo guaraní somos recién contacto hace 60 años y también nosotros somos muy historiadores, cantores y tenemos una risa muy profunda y somos recolectores de fruta, pescadores y también somos curanderas, curanderos, tenemos conocimientos plantas para curar y cuidar y proteger a nuestros niños.
So I'd like to start by telling you a little bit about where I come from and my people. The Waorani people were recently contacted, going back to just the late 1950s. We are storytellers, we are singers, we are very funny, we love to share laughs. We're fruit gatherers and hunters, and we are healers.
Mi pueblo guaraní en el Ecuador están asentados 3 provincias, es muy grande, Pastaza, Napo, Riana. Mi pueblo guaraní viven muy profundo, no somos habitantes mucho, somos habitantes 4,000 habitantes, muy poquito, y tenemos la diversidad milenaria, recurso muy grande.
My people inhabit 3 provinces in Ecuador, in the Amazon. We're not very many people, only about 4,000, but we control and have always controlled a massive territory filled with a lot of biodiversity and diversity of plant life.
Y donde yo vivo, comunidad guaraní de Pastaza, no hay carretera, no hay empresas petroleras y vivimos sano, en lugar muy sano, libre y armonía.
Where I live, my community and our territory is deep in the forest, and it's free from roads, it's free from oil extraction. We live healthy and we live free.
Y me siento muy orgullosa de representar como guaraní porque mis ancestros defendían por miles de años, muchos años, y ellos, mis ancestros, tenían mucho respeto a la tierra madre, porque nos da vida. Ellos sabían, ellos eran científicos, ellos eran profesores, ellos eran maestros. Me enseñaron a mí. Gracias a ellos, a mi papá, tengo una vida que debo defender.
I'm very, very proud of my people and where I come from. For thousands of years, we have defended our territories and our lands. We respect our land because it gives us life. My ancestors were scientists, they were teachers, and I give thanks to them because they taught me, they instilled in me the values that I have today and my will to defend our territory.
De repente, el gobierno ecuatoriano con los otros países se reunió para vender bloque 22, donde yo vivo, dijo que hay petróleo, sin hacer consulta a nosotros. De repente me recuerdo, llegó en una avioneta en 15 minutos. Donde yo vivo es 22 comunidades, muy pequeño, pero la reserva riqueza es muy grande, muy bonito. Llega 10 minutos y dice, ¿qué necesidad tienen? Necesidad de educación, salud, puede dar una cancha, cubierto y se van. Y dice que ya han consultado para operación en petrolera empresa.
So I mentioned that our territory is free from oil, but that doesn't mean that there are no threats. The Ecuadorian government tried to auction off our lands in what's called Oil Block 22, but they didn't do any real consultation. Where I live, it's 22 communities. It's not very many communities, but we control a very large territory. And the government, what they did is they arrived in a small airplane one day. They spent about 15 minutes in one community, and they asked people what they need. And they talked about healthcare centers, they talked about schools, they talked about building a soccer pitch, and then they left.
Ahí yo me recuerdo que como esos años me nació coraje, porque sabemos que el petróleo ha traído daño en otras nacionalidades, donde yo vivo y yo, también a mi propia gente Waorani, la empresa petrolera ha traído la enfermedad y la muerte. Y eso sabía como madre, dije, nosotros no vamos a permitir. Y yo encabecé con mujeres ancianas, con jóvenes, diciendo que nosotros no vamos a vender bloque 22. No existe para nosotros existe lleno de vida. Y muchos por siglos años nuestros pueblos, nuestros abuelos se han defendido. Y la tierra nos ha dado vida y no necesitamos salud, educación. Tenemos nuestra salud, propia medicina, tenemos nuestra propia educación. Y eso nosotros hemos enfrentado y hemos ganado un histórico fallo en el Ecuador. Y así debe garantizar, si alguna cosa, no solo petrolera, si quieren entrar, tiene que hacer con el sentimiento de nosotros el conocimiento. Si decimos no, no tienen que venir a intervenir, a imponer a nuestro territorio. Eso lo que quiero decir significa, nosotros como pueblos indígenas en toda parte, Perú, Ecuador, en todo el mundo, somos que hemos amado por miles de años y hemos respetado. La madre tierra da vida, no debemos violar. Nosotros sabemos como pueblos indígenas, pero las sociedades de industria, capitalismo, de lo que aquí sus sociedades, es una amenaza grande a todo el mundo. Y por eso yo he venido a dar mensaje, para mí me cuesta como mujer, joven, madre, que lucho al frente la muerte y la vida. Para mí no hay solución. Muchas veces me he reflexionado, ni políticos, ni gobiernos van a salvar la vida de la selva. Todos, como pueblos, sus sociedades, tienen que sacrificar. ¿De qué estamos hablando? En futuras generaciones. ¿Nuestros hijos queremos que viven contaminados del río, con la enfermedad y la muerte? ¿A dónde estamos hablando? Y eso yo como mujer vengo fuerte desde mi corazón y con llanto, con dolor de lo que está haciendo. Muchas gentes no saben la realidad de lo que está pasando, está afectando. Desde occidental del mundo ha venido disminuyendo. Ahora hagamos preguntas de qué estamos tratando. ¿Vamos a estar con mascarilla toda la vida? ¿Cómo vamos a educar a nuestros hijos con mascarilla? Esta enfermedad llegó desde una evolución más económica alta, ahora está en Amazonía. Nosotros hemos curado con nuestras plantas. Gracias a ella todavía seguimos, curación tenemos y me preocupa eso, que se reflexionen, que tengan conciencia.
So when the government came to our territories, we began to understand that this was about an oil auction, an oil block. And I became I became furious because I've seen in neighboring indigenous communities the result of oil extraction. I've seen how it brings sickness and death to these communities. So I began to organize among my people, bringing elders and youth together. And we made a decision to say no to oil in our lands, and we decided to defend our lands. We recognize that the land gives us everything we need. We don't need what the government was offering. We have our own education. We have our own healthcare centers. So we took our fight to the courtroom and we won. And we won based on our right to a proper consultation and our right to give consent over anything that happens in our lands. Indigenous peoples love and have loved for time immemorial our land. We've respected our earth. It's really the outside society, your society, that has brought in this extraction mentality. And for us, extraction is death. And we also know that politicians and outsiders aren't going to save our territories. It's up to us. But it's not only up to Indigenous peoples. It's also up to all of you. Everyone needs to sacrifice. Right now, Indigenous peoples are on the front lines giving up our lives to defend our land. We shouldn't be the only ones that are doing it. It also requires that sacrifice from everybody who's here. Do you want your children to suffer and live in a world that is sick and contaminated? Do you want your children to have a better future? So I come with my message, which is that we all need to join together and we all need to fight together. And I hope that everyone can realize that. You know, do you want your children to always have to wear a face mask? Because this pandemic and this sickness, it didn't just come out of nowhere. It's a result of our society and the way that we're living. In my territory, we have our own treatments for COVID-19 that has kept us safe. And that is connected to our ancestral medicine, the way we've always lived.
Y antes de finalizar, quisiera decir eso como yo, en general, hablando, los indígenas ya sabemos la vida que es destrucción. Por eso, por miles de años, hemos respetado a la tierra madre porque es sencilla. La tierra madre tampoco no espera que salvemos. Eso yo te he traído un profundo mensaje porque mi padre todavía vive, porque mi padre era una de las personas que vivía en la selva sin luz, sin enfermedad. Mi papá dice, vivíamos feliz. La conquista, la colonización, el petróleo, el carretera, la vida, tecnología más avanzada, más fácil, ha traído esa consecuencia. Y lo que poco queda tenemos que defender. No es solamente para el pueblo indígena, es para el mundo. Ahora recién como básico escucho, científico están diciendo, pero para mí es un básico. Nosotros eso sabíamos hace miles de años, que se puede causar daño a la muerte llegar. Por eso es muy importante, mi mensaje he traído desde muy lejos como mujer waorani, que no esperen que luchen solo pueblos indígenas, que unan lucha con ustedes, con la sociedad, se puede cambiar, porque sé que el gobierno y capitalismo nunca van a respetar, nunca van a parar, porque van a querer y más cosas fáciles y más dinero, pero la vida no están dando cuenta en futuras generaciones a dónde estamos yendo. No estamos yendo más adelante, no vamos a dejar esa consecuencia, nos vamos a hacer sufrir en otras generaciones. Eso es mi preocupación, porque yo vengo con mucho orgullo, con mucho coraje, porque mi territorio todavía existe virgen, todavía está lo poco que queda. No queremos destrucción, no queremos que invierten, que petróleo, que exterminen mi territorio y que nos causa en calentamiento global que estamos ahora viviendo. Todos estamos conectados con la tierra y debemos respetar. Ese es mi mensaje.
My people have a solution, and we've always had this solution. And the answer is really quite simple. It's that nature doesn't expect us to save her. Nature expects us to respect her. My father, he would tell me growing up how he lived in a time before electric light, before technology, before the roads. And he's talked about how happy life was back then. Really, development for us and technology has brought problems. We've known for thousands of years how to live in harmony with nature and with our lands. And my message really for all of you is to repeat that it's not just up to Indigenous peoples to defend life on planet Earth and defend a future for our children. We need everyone to join together. Governments and this capitalist system aren't going to respect this planet, and they're not going to respect us. They just want more and more. And there's no end to that. So we all need to ask ourselves the question, where do we want to go? What do we want for our children? I'm here and I'm angry because right now my land is healthy. Right now my people live well in our territory, and I don't want a future that's contaminated. I want my children to continue to enjoy the same quality of life that I have and my parents have had. And so that is really my message for you all, is if we want a better future for our children, we need to join together and we need to make a change.
Thank you, Namonte. Thank you for that very powerful presentation. I'd just like to get a feel for if folks in the room have questions that we'd like to ask the panelists, because we're not going to ask questions now, but I just want to know, we're trying to time things because we're late in our scheduling. Just a show of hands of how many people would like to ask a question at some point. We have one.
Maybe we can also collect questions on the stream. When the streaming have to go, maybe we can take a few at the
Yes,
as well.
good point.
And even after the sound.
Okay. So we'll continue with the panel. Our next question is, it actually follows what Namonte just was presenting. And basically, we'd like to ask you, what are the most important things that policymakers can do, actions they can take that will make a dramatic difference for you, for your people, and for the planet? So what are the key things that you think we should be doing and thinking of? Arcana, perhaps I'll start with you again. So just some quick insights from your end, please.
I think one of the very crucial thing which I feel in terms of the policy making spaces, like being part of the UN Secretary General's Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change, I have felt the difference because that space has been very frank, honest, and I think we need more leadership like Secretary General across the globe, where young people, indigenous people, local communities are given space where we can be very honest to the power. I think that is one of the things which I would see in the policy making spaces. Second thing which I feel is this need of intersectional approach in the policy making spaces. We do have policies in segregation, whether we talk about environment restoration, biodiversity conservation, climate action, but I think it should not go in silos, and we need an intersectional approach, which also brings down to another thing which I want to say is that I have been advocating that indigenous people, local communities, and young people should be leaders of climate action and not victims of it, and victims of climate policies. And when I say this, I think it's really important because often the policies which are made towards solution often further makes us more vulnerable. And this also brings down to sharing a short insight from my field visit. I had been interacting with an indigenous community leader during my field visit. And I asked him about his community and how they have been doing. And then he said that there was a plantation drive in our area and we resisted. And I was like, why did you resist the plantation drive? What was the problem? Then he said that they had brought fruit trees to plant in our regions. And I was like, what is the problem with fruit trees? Then he said they had brought mango trees and jackfruit trees for plantation. And if they plant mango trees and jackfruit trees in the periphery of our village, then the wild animals and wild boars will come to eat it. And when the wild animals and wild boars come to eat it, they'll destroy our agriculture crops, and it will also lead to human and wildlife conflict. And that's why we resisted fruit trees, and we have been pushing for another tree, which is the sal tree. And me, being indigenous myself, did not know this perspective. And that's when I think it's really, really important to have free, prior and informed consent of indigenous people and local communities when we are making this policies. And it's really important to ensure that the participation of indigenous people are there from the grassroots levels, because the policies in terms of, ensuring ecosystem restoration and climate actions have often led to indigenous people being more vulnerable. And that's why I feel that needs to be a stop on greenwashing. And I also would like to emphasize that it's really important we prioritize protection of natural forest than plantation of artificial forest. I would like to sum up as to what further needs to be done into the policy making spaces. I think it's really, really crucial in the policy making spaces to ensure safe and enabling spaces for young people, indigenous people, and local communities. Because in the policy making spaces, we often want to make them part only mere in the consultation processes, like interacting with them, getting their feedback, and fitting into the policy document and draft. I think that's not enough. We need people from indigenous people, local communities, from the drafting to implementation to monitoring, because it's really, really crucial to have seat on the table. And I, being in this international spaces, I feel that if you don't have your representation, there's literally no one speaking about indigenous people. And this is something which is really, really important, because we need our representation across the board and in all diversity. Because sometimes people just pick up indigenous people from all across the globe and say we did a representation. It's wrong. It's not. My representation from Asia is different from Latin America in terms of the context. Definitely our struggles have similarities, our challenges have similarity, our solutions have similarities, but I cannot represent other region, and that's why I feel we need representation in all diversity from across the region. And I think there's so much space in this policy making spaces. It's the structure which makes it impossible, or makes you feel that there is literally no spaces. I would like to end by saying that often we have been glorified for our resilience. I think that needs to be stopped, because it's enough of glorification done in terms of our resilience, which we have been doing with our ancestral knowledge and tradition. I think the structures and systems in place which are making us vulnerable needs to be changed. And that's why I push forward and advocate for more of structural changes in this entire discourse of climate action, environment restoration, and biodiversity conservation. Also, loss and damage needs to be prioritized, because a loss of identity, culture, and tradition and language cannot be compensated. And that's why I feel it's really, really important to ensure that all of this narrative is coming from a lens of justice, is coming from a lens of intergenerational equity, and at the same time, it is also ensuring that how we push forward for climate finance. And as Solange was rightly saying, that we need to ensure that we have climate finance pushed forward to the indigenous people, making it accessible, but also specifically to indigenous people, women, and young people. And I would like to say that in this entire policy making spaces, the need of the hour is to stop denial. We are in a climate crisis. We are in a crisis of environmental degradation. We all can work together. And for which, for my indigenous people, young people, I would like to say that you're doing amazing work. Let's continue to do this work. Let's embrace our identity, and it is only when we know ourselves, embrace our identity, we can push forward for more of action. And at the end, we all are contributing towards climate action. We all can contribute to it. We all are making difference. We all can make difference. What it requires is to take that one step. Thank you.
Thank you, Karna, for that very positive message. Sara Elvira, if you had a meeting with the Swedish government, what would you ask them?
Well, I would say a lot. But yeah, for the first, I would say that justify that indigenous rights are human rights, of course. And I want to see a Sami self-determination, that we are included in decisions that are touching our lands, our waters, the issues that we are a part of. And yeah, what more? Give our future or our youth faith in the future, because right now it's kind of far away how they are treating the Sami people in Sweden and how they treat the climate issue. Yeah.
Thank you. Anushka, in Peru and elsewhere, because the Amazon is under threat everywhere, what are the key things that policymakers can do, either in Peru or elsewhere, to change the situation and make things better for your people and your rights?
Ok, también tengo una pregunta. ¿Cuántos años vamos a hablar con respecto a la tierra, al derecho al ambiente? Sabemos que estamos 50 años entablados hablando lo mismo tema, el mismo tema, pero sin embargo no veo cambio. Sí he visto cambios negativos que nos hacen mucho daño. Necesitamos seguridad territorial. Necesitamos ser dueños del suelo y de subsuelo, ya que hay tantas amenazas, las superposiciones con concesiones encima y no nos pertenece el suelo. La concesión minera extrae oro y deja exterminado nuestro territorio. Por eso al gobierno le exigiría, primero, para tener una incidencia política que se haga el Ministerio de los Pueblos Indígenas. El otro es que queremos que nos reconozcan la seguridad territorial. Y seguridad integral también. Territorio integral. Ya se perdió.
No.
Ah, okay.
I also have a question, if I may. So how many years we will be talking about the rights of the environment and the rights that need to be respected? Because we have been talking about that for 50 years, but we have not seen many changes. I saw a few negative changes that impacted our territories. And we need territory security, land security, both for our soil and also for the underground, because the mining companies, they come to our territories, they extract gold, and that has also a negative impact in our territories. So if I were to meet with the policymakers, I would ask them three things. First, I would ask for an Indigenous Peoples ministry to be established. Secondly, I would ask for territorial security and also for territorial integrity.
Por eso, pongan los ojos a la Amazonía y del mundo. Ayúdenos a conservar, ayúdenos a proteger, ayúdenos a cuidar. El oro, el dinero, se acaba. Pero los recursos están ahí. Y que nosotros como organización, ¿de qué vale que luchemos siempre? Es como reclamar, pero no somos escuchados. No nos están ayudando para protegernos, para proteger. Porque a todos los que protegemos, a todas las personas que defendemos nuestro territorio, actualmente en Perú, a los que conservan, a los indígenas y no indígenas, nos están matando. Crimen, estos últimos tiempos, mujeres y varones, ya tenemos más de 17 muertos. Y eso duele. Para nosotros, bueno, traduce.
So that's why we need to keep our eyes on the Amazon region. You need to help us to care for it, to protect it. Gold, there is gold, money, there is money, but it ends. But our resources are there, and we need to take care of them while they are still there. As an organization, we make our demands, our claims, but we are not heard. And also we see that land defenders, indigenous peoples, and also non-indigenous people that defend the territories and the environments are being killed. And this year, we have already had 17 killings, both for men and women, and that hurts.
Gracias, mi amor. Los quiero mucho a todos y todas. Seguiremos protegiendo la Amazonía. Hasta pronto. Thank you.
And thank you very much. And meus amores, mis amores, thank you very much. I love you very much, and let's continue protecting nature. Let's continue caring for it. Thank you.
Nemante, you helped set the stage for this question because you already, in your introductory remarks, talked about what we need to do and how we need to act. Is there anything else that you'd like to add about something policymakers can do and everybody here can do to make a big difference for you and your people?
Bueno, yo le digo, el derecho de decisiones en nuestro territorio tiene que permitir que deciden los pueblos, porque hay un decreto, es muy peligroso, que los políticos, los gobiernos, nosotros, claro, vivimos en la Amazonía, estamos ahí, no movemos, defendemos, pero lo que pasa, el decreto dice, suelo es para indígena, abajo, dentro es del Estado, es como que no garantiza. No va a cambiar eso, aunque lo más nosotros exigimos que respete, pero no va a haber ese respeto. Y también me gustaría las organizaciones más grandes que apoyan Fondo Verde, que muchos hablan de medio ambiente, cambio climático, sientan a dialogar y dar mucho dinero a los políticos, realmente que no apoya directo a las comunidades, lo que defienden, lo que viven. Ese es el problema, yo veo, por eso no hay cambio, sigue amenaza, insiste esas cosas. Eso no me parece mucho, como dijo la compañera, hay que hacer participar los propios indígenas que viven realmente en las comunidades luchando al frente de línea, tienen que ser partícipes en espacios como así, como otros lugares en toma de decisión como indígena. Hay muchas veces que yo veo muy triste, los políticos asumen en vez de dar la oportunidad a los jóvenes, los líderes, las mujeres de territorio que salgan, es que deciden las políticas y eso no hay cambio, sigue. Eso es muy triste mirar la realidad.
So yeah, the message that I would transmit to the governments and everybody here is to respect, honor, and uplift our right as indigenous peoples to decide what happens in our lands. Right now in Ecuador, there are a couple of decrees, executive decrees that have been issued that are really tragic and really demonstrate that the government, although it talks about respecting indigenous rights, is doing the exact opposite. There are 2 executive decrees to expand oil and mining across the country, much of which is found within our territories. At the same time, in Ecuador, we as indigenous peoples don't own the rights to the subsoil, just the surface soil. So that puts us in a really vulnerable position as well. And what we see is a complete lack of respect for how we live within our territories. I also see a lot of big organizations that are working towards a green change, a green shift. But they're working with governments, and their funding and their support is not going to local communities. And as my friend up here on stage said, community participation is key, and we need more participation from communities that are on the front lines fighting to defend our lands in these global decision-making spaces. Right now, politicians are deciding for us, and they're not deciding in our interests.
mensaje. Último mensaje yo daría que las sociedades de aquí den educación a sus hijos, porque sus hijos van a vivir mucho más allá del futuro que va a venir, que se invierten la energía, que conserva y que se respeta la tierra madre, no sus hijos eduquen, estudien para que destruyan a la tierra madre. Eso hay una buena solución. Yo veo mi perspectiva desde la selva hacia mirada hacia afuera, porque veo que siento que nosotros estamos luchando, hablando, no hay cambio porque su sociedad, su industria se está amenazando grande ola en el territorio, en toda Amazonía. Yo siento que no es responsable indígena, es responsable de su sociedad que está haciendo daño y me gustaría que sientan la responsabilidad de la Amazonía. Eso es mi mensaje.
And a final message that I have for all of you here is to educate your children. Because children are the future decision makers over what happens to our planet. Teach them to conserve, to consume less, to protect nature and not destroy. This is the perspective I bring from the forest where I live. I see how Western society and Western lifestyle threatens the earth and threatens my home in the Amazon rainforest. And so I really hope that everyone here, people from Western societies, feel that responsibility to change your lifestyle and to educate your children. That's my message. Thank you very much.
These are very powerful words for all of us to heed, and lots of things for us to think going forward. We all know the international support architecture is critical to realizing rights-based climate conservation and sustainable development, and realize the urgent transformation that we all need to embark on. To discuss this, I would like to invite two representatives from the donor community to tell us their perspective on what their agencies can do to amplify the messages that we've just heard here today. First, I'll invite Ms. Jenny Lopez, Land Governance Advisor for the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office and member of the Indigenous Peoples Local Communities Forest Tenure Pledge Donor Group. Jenny, can you take the mic and perhaps...
Thank you very much, and it's incredibly humbling to be here today and speak after the amazing panel we've had, so thank you to our colleagues. Thank you. I think all the speakers today have really set out the situation incredibly well, and I think it's really clear that a shift in approach is needed, and I think in a way that's the first steps as donors. And I come here today not just on behalf of the UK government, but on behalf of our donor group we have as part of the COP26 pledge on IPLC forest tenure rights. So I come here on behalf of our donor group, and I think that's the first step, is recognising that that shift is needed. As our panelists set out today very well, we know that the role of IPLCs is critical in protecting the forest and protecting land degradation, ecosystem services, biodiversity, and the solutions are there. But we also recognise that despite that evidence, the financing is not reaching the IPLC communities on the ground. And there was a powerful report last year from Rainforest Foundation Norway and Indifo which showed that only 1% of climate change ODA is reaching those communities. So I think that message is heard, donors understand that, but we also recognise that how do we really address this situation? And so that's why the pledge at COP26 for the 1.7 billion, that was just a start. But I think it was quite very significant, first of all, in having that high-profile recognition that this situation is there, we need to address it. So it was important to raise that awareness. And I think also it's a start that we can then build on together as donors in how we're going to work together to address the situation we're in, but not just as donors, but work together with the IPLC stakeholders and communities themselves. So I'm using this pledge as an example of one way that donors can start working together with stakeholders to improve the way we coordinate and collaborate on forest tenure rights, on land rights more broadly, and the importance of this for sustainable livelihoods, sustainable development, but as many have said today, really protecting nature, protecting our forests. So I think another thing that we've really heard very strongly from stakeholders is it's not just how much money we're raising. The 1.7 billion was not a start. It was just a start. I mean, it's not enough. We know that really needs to be scaled up. But I think more importantly than that, it's how that money is spent. It's more we need a shift in the ways those funding flows are being channeled and directed. And I think there's 3 different levels that we're looking to address as donors. And I would also like to emphasize it's not just bilateral donors, it's a collaboration between bilaterals and philanthropic donors. There were 5 bilaterals and 17 philanthropic donors, and I think that's what makes it exciting. There's different ways, there's different roles, there's different opportunities that are available to different funders, and we also recognize there are different levels of funding flows that are needed, and that goes from finances that are channeled more directly on the ground to IPLC organizations, to more national level network building, strengthening national organizations for Indigenous peoples and local communities, through to more government capacity building and understanding incentives and how we work with governments themselves. So there are different levels of funding needed, different levels of ways that donors can be working together. And I think something that the pledge has illustrated is there are the different ways we can coordinate and collaborate, both on the more shorter term opportunities, but also in how we can shift some of the more strategic kind of long-term ways that governments are working to address these issues. And so what we're really trying to achieve through the pledge and together as donors is how we can make sure that funding is channeled more directly, but we're also trying to address some of those systemic barriers in the way that tropical forest country governments are working on the policies, and this was touched on earlier, but also in terms of multilateral climate funding. There's a lot there, a lot of opportunities there in how we can try and shift some of those approaches. And I think also what's been come across really strongly today is how we can be learning from, how we can be ensuring that there is meaningful engagement with the IPLC stakeholders themselves. So not just FPIC, that is critical to have free, prior and informed consent, but also how IPLC communities can be a part of the process of designing the work that is happening, so that they really have meaningful engagement all the way through in the way that we are doing programming. So I think that's also something that we're looking to take forward and see how we can scale up together as donors. I think just finally, I'll touch on how we can ensure that women and youth are part of that. And I think if you read the donor supporting statement that came with the pledge, women and youth are recognised, they're acknowledged as part of that. And I think that's something as donors we really need to ensure is not just something we add on the end of what we are setting out to do, but it's really a key part, and it's embedded throughout the programming and work we take forward. And I think COP27 will present an interesting opportunity, because I think also, you hear lots of pledges, you hear lots of commitments from donors, but how do we hold ourselves accountable for that? And I think the pledge, again, we, in a way, we're putting ourselves out there as donors. The pledge lasts from 2021 to 25. So each year we will provide, a report. What is the progress we're making? And by 2025, you'll be able to really hold us to account for, well, what have you achieved? How have you shifted things? What's changed? So in a way, I think that's also something we can do as donors, is improve that transparency, improve that accountability, so that you have those platforms and those opportunities to challenge us as well in what we can keep doing better. I'll stop there because I'm getting lots of looks, but I'm happy to talk more. But thank you again for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Jenny. I'd like to invite Emma Norrand Tickner she is Program Manager at Sida and also responsible for the global portfolio on land rights, to share what Sida is doing and thinking on these issues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alan. And I've also been getting looks, so I'll try to be very brief. But as Alan said, my name is Emma Norstad Tickner. I work as a program manager, and I'm responsible for the global portfolio of land rights at Sida. I've listened to you today as a representative for a donor, but also, I think, as a citizen of the earth and as a mother. And I've been very inspired and humbled hearing your messages. And I've heard you say that you don't feel listened to and that you don't feel consulted in a real way. And you don't feel that you have the actual right to your land. I've also heard that your rights and even your lives are at stake for the work that you do. And I think the main title for Stockholm Plus 50 is A Healthy Planet and There's Prosperity for All. Our responsibility, our opportunity. And when I was preparing for this, I was thinking a little bit about the responsibility and the opportunity that we have to work together on these issues. And I think that we have a true responsibility to listen to you and to consult you in all the decisions that we make going forward. And I think that we also have the responsibility to try and amplify the messages that you have conveyed here today and in other forums. I think we have a responsibility to channel funds and support to your groups with as a direct impact as possible on the work that you're doing. And I think we have a responsibility to support and protect you as environmental defenders. I think that Sida's priorities in many ways also are an opportunity to work together. Sida has a very strong commitment in investing in climate funding, in biological diversity, but also in human rights. And we heard Joan speak about what is the human rights-based approach. And I think those perspectives is something that we can link up. We have a specific task from the government to work with biological diversity. And actually today I also saw that the new strategy on climate was decided on, which has increased significantly in volume. So there I also see opportunities for us to work together and to support land rights and to support IPLCs going forward. We know that the voices and the knowledge of IPLCs are key to safeguarding our common biological diversity, our climate. And I hope that the event today lies the foundation for increased and deepened collaboration with all of you here today, of course with Jenny next to me, and also all of you in the audience. I hope that was brief enough. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Emma. I'd like to invite Nonette Royo to share just a couple words to close the session for us. Nonette is Executive Director of the Tenure Facility, if she needed an introduction, but I believe all of you know her by now. Nonette.
Yes, it's on. Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you to all. I really have just a few words, maybe 4 words. We've heard what our guardians of the forest, our stewards of nature have already said. I really think that we all know in our hearts that they mean it and they have been doing it for us, protecting forests, nature, everything that we are all dependent on or upon is in good hands. So we help them. We help the people who are out there in the front lines. What I have been hearing is that we help with financing, we help with their land rights, and that is a very complex challenge, helping them with their land rights. And what they're asking us to do is to understand that it means a lot to do it with them. So they have to define what it is, how it is done, and trust that those are very accountable. Now this is now our challenge. We have to bridge our needs. They are telling us they have systems that are accountable, and we want them to be accountable. So that's one. Second, protecting nature is also using nature, and the interdependence is very important. I think risks is part of the work. They have told us of all the risks that they are going through, and they are putting their lives on the line. There is no other description of what giving to healing the planet is. There's no other love that the kind that they're giving us and they're sharing with us. So in there, we understand that they have spirit and longevity, that they connect in a manner that is deep, oral, traditional, cultural, intergenerational, and they act. So thank you. That's all I can say.
Thank you, Nanette. Please stay on stage. I'd like to invite Solange and Joan to come on stage and to thank everybody. Please come.
Please. Thank you all so much. We would just... yes.
Well, I think first things first, a huge hand of applause for this incredible panel and all the insights that we heard today. And if I may, yes, please take a picture. Yes, I wanted to say this day would not be possible without, yes, okay. No. Oh, maybe whatever works.
You can conclude and we'll end with a photo.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to mention that this day would not be possible without the tremendous work of Maria, Emma, Magdalena, Selina, Anna, Paula, Karen, and Eleanor.